Hi everyone. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. I am going to tell you a story. Or at least I'm going to read you a story. So this story is called Weiners. More wieners, said Dennis, shaking his head as his wife dumped an armful of frankfurters into the trolley. She huffed and puffed, trying to catch her breath. At 32 stone, simple things like grocery shopping were becoming difficult and strenuous. She leaned on the trolley for support. There was a groan, the higher-pitched squeal of protesting metal, and a crack as a wheel was crushed under her weight. She was flung forward, but managed to catch herself, stopping with a jiggling of jowl and a swaying of hoop earrings. Dennis was impressed, so he tactfully avoided comment and continued to push the now three-wheeled trolley around the store. It was her word, Weiners, a relic from her childhood in America, and he had picked it up through constant repetition, reflecting her own dialogue back at her like a mirror. He could hear her in his head. "We're almost out of wieners, Dennis. Dennis, put some wieners in the pot, will you?" "Where are my wieners, Dennis?" Something had gone wrong in the piece of universe that Dennis occupied, and it had been so gradual that he hadn't noticed until it was completely irreversible. Watching his wife, her pudgy frame squashed into a short dress 2 sizes too small, wobble around under the 2 bright lights of the superstore, Dennis began to feel that he was perhaps not quite as happy as he thought he was. Contentment had given way to complacency. He was a moon orbiting around his wife's gravity, distant yet unable to escape from her. They reached the checkout. She had managed to put more wieners in the trolley without him noticing. In fact, Dennis observed that she had finally foregone mince, chops, and chicken in favor of wieners. Tinned, fresh, and frozen, the wieners rolled along the conveyor and into reusable bags, which Dennis packed and loaded into the car. "I hear Maureen and Clive are vacationing in the Maldives this year," she said, as he climbed into the driver's seat. She had an open pack of frankfurters on her lap and was already on her third. She reminded Dennis of the conveyor belt as she ate all 12 without pause. The seat belt was so tight around her waist that it was lost beneath the flesh of her stomach. "That's nice, love," Dennis responded. "I wish we could go there instead of that damp caravan park," she said, shifting in her seat and tugging at the seatbelt across her chest. "It's so cramped." It was a pleasant drive from the superstore back home to their cottage in the village of Parnham Mills. Once off the motorway, it was tiny lanes, hedges, and, depending on the season, fields of sugar beet, winter barley, and sheep. Dennis was not looking at the scenery, however. He was focused on driving carefully around bumps and dips in the road to try and save his suspension. It was sitting rather low to the ground on this occasion. It hadn't always been like this, Dennis reflected. His father had encouraged him to get a trade. People never stopped needing plumbers, he'd say multiple times a week when Dennis was a teenager. And Dennis hadn't been sure if he agreed with his dad or if he had undergone a mild form of brainwashing. Either way, he moved to London from Suffolk and apprenticed as a plumber. It was there that he had met Doreen. Dennis thought she could be a model. She wore strappy dresses with shorts, hoop earrings, and had her blonde hair high in a ponytail. A second-year French literature student, she had a twang in her accent and a bounce in her step. Dennis was in love. Their friends dubbed them the Double Ds, and life was great. Doreen had so much present back then, not quite in the way she had now. She would absorb all the energy and life of the people around her, and then reflect it back 1,000 times over. She was a star. "There's no more space," said Dennis, trying to shove a pack of 12 in the fridge once they had got home. "I told you we should have got a bigger fridge," Doreen replied from the living room. She was lying on the sofa, reading a glossy magazine. "The fridge is big enough. It's all these damn wieners." Dennis threw the 3 remaining packs across the kitchen. "Mm-hmm," Doreen said, She licked a finger and turned over a page. "Dennis, put some wieners on, won't you? I'm a bit peckish." 10 minutes later, without quite knowing why, Dennis brought a plate heaped with 36 steaming frankfurters and placed them on the coffee table. As Doreen reached over to grab one, he saw how her wedding ring sat so tight on her finger that the flesh bulged around it. He noted how the color of her skin was blotched with red and purple, the tiny capillaries scurrying across the surface. He opened his mouth to speak, but turned away instead. He was running late for his Saturday afternoon pint with Jack anyway. The pub had petrified oak beams in the ceiling, the knots visible in dark spirals, and thick glass windows that distorted the images on the other side, bending and reshaping them. Dennis found it to be a sort of refuge, a center point in his life that had remained unchanged. Dennis had moved to Parnham Mills, back to Suffolk, 2 years after the wedding. Doreen had come to the pub with him then. She would play darts and pool and chat with the wives of the other men while sipping her vodka orange. He tried to remember the last time Doreen had come with him and failed. It had been years now. He found a stool next to Jack. "You all right, mate?" asked Jack, indicating for the barman to pour 2 pints. "Tickety-boo, Jack. All good," replied Dennis, looking out the window. "Doreen wants to go to the Maldives this year," he said, taking a sip of his pint. Jack made no reply. "She says the caravan's cramped," Dennis continued. The men stared straight ahead, avoiding each other's gaze. "Well," said Jack slowly, after some time of silent drinking, "fair play to her. At least she's got something different on her mind." The silence resumed before Jack carefully changed the topic. "Been some rum weather these days," he said. "Due a bit of a storm, I heard." The sun had slipped beneath the horizon as Dennis walked back to the cottage. And the weather was indeed peculiar. Autumn was often blustery, but for several days now the sky had been filling up with big black clouds that just hung there. Dennis could almost feel their weight pressing down on him and down on the land. It seemed that at any moment the ground would crack beneath the bulk, and giant fissures would open up across the fields, swallowing hedges and trees. There was a taste of metal in the air, too. Dennis suspected lightning was on the way. The wind sailed up the lane and whipped his tweed cap off his head, sending it spinning into the sky. "Dennis! Dennis, come quick!" yelled Doreen from the bedroom. It was a week later, Sunday to be precise. The clouds had not left Parnham Mills, but the wind had died down. Any day now, the village was assured, they would all be drenched from dawn until dusk. Dennis clicked his tongue, put his breakfast aside, and walked up the stairs to his bedroom. "Yes, love?" "Look, Dennis," said Doreen, twirling around in one of her dresses. "It's not as tight as it was last week." Dennis had to agree. There wasn't as much arm fat being squashed out the sides, and there seemed to be less strain on the tiny plastic belt. "I'm wearing it on the next hold down," said Doreen when she saw him looking. "Is that normal?" asked Dennis. "Why shouldn't it be?" Doreen replied, as she turned to preen in the mirror. "People lose weight all the time." Dennis left her to it, but he was beginning to worry. Doreen was almost more obsessed with wieners than ever. She had stopped boiling or microwaving them, preferring to just eat them straight out the packet. Midweek they had to make another trip to the superstore. Doreen had cleared the cottage of wieners. Dennis was concerned. She had doubled her intake, but had gone down another 2 sizes. He wondered if it had to do with the wieners. He was also quite certain that you weren't meant to lose so much so quickly. Doreen refused to see the doctor, though. He'd made some comments back when she was 16 stone that she didn't find at all helpful to her situation. Along with the groceries, Doreen insisted on buying a new digital scale for the bathroom, and when they arrived back at the cottage, she raced up the stairs. For Doreen, this involved clinging to the railing, heavy panting, reddening of the face, and beads of sweat forming across her forehead as she hauled herself up 1 foot at a time. After a rest to get her breath back, Dennis watched her step onto it. Doreen couldn't see over her own chest and stomach, so Dennis got on his hands and knees beneath his huge wife and waited for the little numbers to settle. He was glad that he couldn't see her face. "Says here you're 34 stone, love," said Dennis carefully. Doreen shifted on the scale. Dennis heard it creak. "That can't be right, Dennis. I've lost weight, not put it on." "Don't have a go at me. I'm only telling you the numbers," he replied, getting to his feet. "It must be defective," insisted Doreen, as she stomped out the bathroom, squashing Dennis against the wall as she pushed past him. Dennis looked at the scale and stepped on it. He then retrieved the old scale from the airing cupboard. It was a mechanical one with a little red needle. He stepped on that as well. Dennis knew a lot about plumbing. He was very successful in Parnham Mills and the surrounding villages, travelling in his white van with its big sticker on the side. Dennis didn't know much about anything else, really, and he certainly didn't know what to do with the fact that he weighed the same on both scales. Doreen was losing weight. He could see it with his own eyes. But according to the scale, she was also getting heavier at the same time. That weekend, the clouds finally broke, sending down bolts of lightning and rain in a sheet like a frosted glass. On Sunday, Dennis woke up to find that Doreen had not only lost weight in the night, she had shrunk. Doreen had fallen asleep on the couch surrounded by dozens of empty Wiener packets. She was now lost among them. Dennis had to sift through them to find his formerly morbidly obese wife. She was the size of an 8-year-old, and Dennis found that he couldn't look at her and the space around her at the same time. He had to focus on one or the other. Trying to look at Doreen as a whole in her surroundings made things look blurry and distorted. It was similar to looking through one of those antique windows with the bullseye in them, like the ones at the pub. He tried to lift Doreen from the Wiener packet pile. She was so heavy that he almost put his back out. He couldn't even roll her. Dennis was at a loss, but he knew he had to do something. He picked up his phone and nervously tapped in 999. What would he say? What could he say? Phone in hand but number undialed, Dennis shook Doreen awake. She looked at him without focusing on his face and hauled herself to her feet with much effort. Then she began to shrink right in front of him, Wiener packets crinkling as her legs moved upwards, and she was suspended above the floor, getting smaller and smaller. The air shimmered around her in waves, and there was a sound almost like static, just audible above the rain outside. "More Wieners, Dennis," said Doreen in a faint, high-pitched voice that ended in a pop, and she was no longer there. Dennis moved toward where she had been. The air was still wrong, and when Dennis peered closer, squinting his eyes, he saw a tiny pinhead of black where Doreen's chest had been. He put his phone down and fetched a magnifying glass. Peering through it, he saw tiny flecks of dust slowly spiraling around the tiny black hole, flaring red as they reached its edge. He noticed that if he got too close, the hair on his arms began to stand on end and reach for the hole, and he could feel it pull in his body like a magnet. As an experiment, Dennis picked up a crumb of Wiener he had spotted on the floor and dropped it just in front of the black hole. The Wiener hovered for just a second before it began to spiral toward where Doreen had been. It slowed as it got closer to the edge before appearing to stop. The piece of Wiener then stretched out like spaghetti before beginning to glow with heat and finally incinerating into microscopic ashes. "Well, I'll be jiggered," said Dennis.